Ladies and gents, welcome back to another video. In front of us here is an iPad. I believe this is an iPad 3rd gen, never been updated, should be running iOS 5. So we're gonna get this thing opened up, see what kind of condition it's in. Hopefully we've got ourselves a cool vintage iPad running a cool version of iOS that we can talk about today. So with all that said, let's get this thing opened up and see what we've got. All right, nice and easy there on the packaging. Here's our iPad, definitely a 3rd gen. We've got our lightning connector down there, and it just feels like a 3rd gen. After you've held a bunch of these, you can actually tell based on the weight and the thickness, the difference between the 2nd and 3rd gen iPads without actually seeing them turned on. This is the 16 gig model, Wi-Fi only, so no bells and whistles there. Let's see if this thing has any power or if we're gonna have to plug it in. And it does have power, and check that out. We've got the old style Apple logo. That is a great sign. That means we've got at least iOS 6, hopefully iOS 5, as that would make this a super rare device to have. All right, here we go on the home screen. Let me go ahead and adjust the camera so you guys can see a little better. And we'll go ahead and shift this iPad so it fits in the frame as well. Okay, here we are, slide to unlock. Let's see what we've got. And it is iOS 5. You can tell right away, thanks to that YouTube icon, which Apple so graciously removed in iOS 6. Makes life for us collectors a lot easier in determining which version of iOS a device has without actually seeing the number. But good news for us, we can see that version number. So let's head into settings, general, and about. And you can see we're running iOS 5.1.1. So I believe that is the last version of iOS 5 that came out. So nothing too special there, other than the fact that it's running here on an iPad 3rd gen, which for whatever reason is very difficult to find. Now I say for whatever reason, I do actually kind of have an idea why that is. We'll talk about that in just a moment. No iCloud account, that's a great sign. And really there's not a whole lot to do here inside of settings. Compare that to the new version of iOS, and it is night and day difference here between iOS 5 and iOS 18. So this 3rd gen iPad came out in early 2012, about a year after the 2nd gen iPad. A lot of big changes here, the most important of which is the retina display. This was the first iPad to feature that. And if it'll focus here on my iPhone, you can see that the text and the pixels look incredibly crisp here. This was a big jump forward compared to the iPad 1st and 2nd gen, which did not have retina displays, and those were really showing their age even when they launched. Many people thought when the iPad 2nd gen came out that it would have a retina display because Apple had been using it on the iPhone 4, which came out several months earlier. But it did not get it. We did not see that retina display until we got the 3rd gen iPad here, and it just looks fantastic. Some other minor differences are the cameras. Now, I believe the rear camera got an upgrade. This is now a 5 megapixel lens, putting it on par with the iPhone 4. Much better than that 0.7 megapixel lens on the 2nd gen camera, and infinitely better than the camera on the 1st gen iPad, which of course does not have a camera. So no comparison there. The front camera did not get a change. This is still a 0.3 megapixel lens there on the front, and it is truly awful. It is drastically terrible. I mean, I can't even describe how bad that camera is. Don't use it for anything. All right, enough complaining there. This is a fantastic device. Retina display, kept the same body. It actually got a little bit thicker. So this iPad was thicker than the iPad 2nd gen to accommodate that Retina display as well as the larger battery inside of this. This thing takes forever to charge, and there's no fast charging. The fastest you can charge is with a 12-watt power adapter, and even with that, it takes hours. I mean, from 0 to 100 on a 3rd and 4th gen iPad, it takes like 8 to 12 hours to charge that thing. It's actually ridiculous how long it takes to charge. So that is a big downside to this thing. And battery life is really not that great. The Retina display requires a lot of energy, not only to run it, but also for the backlight. Because of that higher resolution, this thing requires more energy and brighter backlight to get the same effect here on the front. So that's something to keep in mind. And I think that's the reason the device is thicker, for that larger battery to power it all. And obviously the display itself is a little more advanced. Now, The iPad 3rd gen keeps the same processor as the 2nd gen, at least it does in the CPU department. It's still a 1.0 gigahertz dual core A5 chip. But where things get interesting is in the graphics department. So this is actually the A5X chip, the first of its kind. And what that meant is instead of a dual core graphics, we got quad core graphics. So about twice as powerful, which is great because we have 4 times the number of pixels. So you may be wondering, well, should it be 4 times as powerful? The answer is yes, it should be, and it wasn't. That is a reason that this iPad did not do very well, is because it's very underpowered for its retina display. So while this iPad was able to do just fine on iOS 5 and iOS 6, at least in terms of like scrolling through applications and browsing the web, doing Safari, email, photos, that sort of thing, playing games on this was actually not a very good experience because of how demanding this retina display is and how underpowered the graphics and the CPU is at powering it. The same could be said about the 1st gen iPad. This thing was pretty underpowered with its single core A4 chip, and the iPhone 4 was pretty underpowered with its retina display with its single core A4 chip. So I'm trying to show you guys a little bit of how this is. You can see it is actually very smooth scrolling through Safari here. Unfortunately, it's not loading like I wish it would. Apple's website has since moved past the days of displaying info correctly on iOS 5. You still get a little bit, but you really can't even tell what you're looking at here. But what we can tell is the crispness of the pixels here and the text. I mean, this looks fantastic. It's basically the same pixels per inch as you would find on even the newest iPad models. Apple's made the displays bigger, better, they got higher refresh rates, but the resolution for the most part is essentially the same, at least in terms of pixels per inch. I know the iPads no longer have that 9.7 inch display, but if you were to break it down into a 1 inch by 1 inch section, I think you would have basically the same number of pixels, which is pretty cool that back in 2012, Apple had displays that were good enough to be used here in 2024. And I'd say it certainly is. I mean, this iPad definitely shows its age. I mean, it's old, it's got huge bezels, it still uses the 30-pin connector. This was the last Apple product to have that. But if you took this display and made it with new hardware, I think there'd be no complaints about it other than maybe the fact that it is only 60 hertz. So leaves a little bit to be desired, but that's what Apple's iPad Airs are. They're still 60 hertz and they are, I believe, still LCDs, which is what this is. So there is that. Talking about the exterior, I know we mentioned it's got the same design as the iPad 2nd gen and actually the same design as the 4th gen for that. It does have the little rocker switch there for the volume. We've got the mute lock switch there, which could double also as a rotation lock switch. We've got our power button up here, and these buttons feel nice. I mean, they look good. The black contrasting with the aluminum I think is fantastic, but they're very tactile and easy to use. Over here on this side, we do have a headphone jack. This was certainly not one of the last iPads to feature that headphone jack, because I think that stayed around all the way through the iPad 9th gen. So here we are with the 3rd gen. We got the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and then the 9th gen, I think, was the last Apple product that has the headphone jack, at least as far as I'm aware, apart from the Apple computers, they all still have it. Now, if we were to compare where the iPad came in just 2 short years since the 1st gen came out, it's pretty drastic. We've got the Retina display, we've got cameras on the iPad. This thing has 1 gigabyte of RAM. That was the most ever in an iOS product when it came out. Compare that to just 256 megabytes over here. Big difference there. These can both run iOS 5. That's where this thing started. That's where the 1st gen finishes support. But this thing is much faster. Dual core CPU, quad core graphics. Compare that to a single core CPU with built-in single core graphics. Night and day difference here. The speakers also are pretty good on here. The 1st gen has decent speakers. The 3rd and 4th gen speakers are actually really nice. When I say speakers, there's actually only one. It's hidden down here. So no stereo sound until the iPad mini came out. That was actually the first iPad to feature that, and then it brought its way over into the iPad Air, which would be launched a year later. Now, this iPad can be updated. It would get iOS 6, 7, 8, and then iOS 9 is where this thing finally finished support. And running an iOS 9 iPad 3rd gen is a struggle. I know I talked about this thing being underpowered. Putting it on its last version of iOS is not fun. This thing just chugs through everything. You hardly ever get the smooth 60 frames per second that we're able to see here on this iOS 5 experience. Running this thing on iOS 8 or iOS 9 is honestly not fun. And if you have one of these that is running iOS 9, you can actually downgrade to iOS 8, and then you can dual boot it into, I think iOS 7, 6, maybe even iOS 5. And that's going to split the internal storage in between two versions. One will keep the iOS 8, and then the other one will let you run iOS 6 or 5 or 7 or whatever you choose. And you can do basically anything on there. You can jailbreak it, you can add applications and games, and it will be just as smooth. That's a lot easier if you have a 32 or 64 gig model. If you've got a 16 gig like this, then you're basically stuck with like 3 gigabytes of usable space on each partition there. And it's just really not enough to do much. But it is an option, so that's something to keep in mind if you're not able to get one of these on iOS 5, which is really hard. And I know I was going to talk about that earlier, so let's do that right now. The reason I think the iPad 3rd gen is so hard to get on iOS 5 is, first of all, it wasn't sold for very long. So it came out in early 2012. And if I remember, I'll put the dates up there. That was how long this thing was sold for. And it was quickly replaced by the iPad 4th gen, which was much, much better, way more powerful CPU, a graphics chip that could actually keep up with the retina display. We added the lightning connector on the 4th gen iPad, and I think it got Bluetooth 4.0 for AirDrop. I might be wrong about that. Someone correct me if I am, but those are some big changes. And the iPad 4th gen was a beautiful device, especially on iOS 6. That is a real treat. But even on iOS 10, which is where the 4th gen finishes support, that thing runs really well, much, much better than this does on iOS 9. So this thing was quickly overshadowed by that 4th gen iPad. And what's interesting is Apple did not keep this around. So typically when they launched a new iPad, or an iPhone for that matter, they dropped last year's model down in price and kept selling it. They did not do that here with the 3rd gen. So once that 4th gen came out, they discontinued the 3rd gen, and then they just kept selling the iPad 2nd gen at the $100 discount compared to the 4th gen. So the combination of all those things meant that people did not get the iPad 3rd gen. So it was sold for a short period of time. It wasn't actually that good. It was expensive. It was hot. It didn't take very long for it to die. It was just overall not a really good product. So a lot of people got the 2nd gen because that was a much bigger improvement over the 1st gen than the 3rd is over the 2nd gen. So a lot of people got the 2nd gen. They didn't upgrade to the 3rd gen. And then the 4th gen came out, and a lot of people with the 1st and 2nd gen iPad said, you know what, it's time for a new one. Let's get that 4th gen. So the 3rd gen's just really overlooked, wasn't sold very long, and not a lot of people got it when it was new. Fun fact, they didn't even call this the iPad 3rd gen. I don't know if they still do. When it came out, this was just referred to as the new iPad. For whatever reason, that's just what they called it. To us, obviously, it is the 3rd gen iPad because it's the 3rd one that came out. They even did that with the 4th gen iPad. They called it the iPad with Retina display. So I'm not sure what the deal with that was, why they changed their naming scheme there. But obviously to us, this is a 3rd gen iPad. I'm curious to hear from you guys. What was your first iPad that you ever got? Was it an iPad 3rd gen? I'd be willing to bet that not many of my subscribers or the people that watch my videos owned an iPad 3rd gen, at least not new or when it came out. Maybe you've purchased one since then, like I have, because I know for a fact I did not own one of these. It just did not make sense to get a 3rd gen iPad back when it came out. So leave me a comment down below. Let me know what your first model iPad was. All right, I think that's going to do it for this video. Hope you enjoyed taking a look here at this flagship model, the new iPad from 2012. Thank you guys so much for watching. And as always, I look forward to seeing you in another one of my videos.